where in the world is Magadan? Nobody's ever heard of Magadan. That must be on another planet. Well, no, it's not another planet. It's our neighbor. It's right across the Bering Straits. Lots of contact with Magadan. I mean, I consider it my Russian hometown, родной город.
Лэрри Рокхилл, очень много сделавший для Магадана аляскинец. Один из народных дипломатов, которые работали над расстоплением ледяного занавеса. Так называлась граница между территорией Магаданской области, в которую в то время ходила Чукотка, и Аляски.
Larry, thanks for joining us. So we have some questions for you. We really do hope to see you in April or May. So if we get the chance to meet you in person, that would be great.
Right. Well, I hope so too.
So
Definitely.
to begin with, could you tell us a little about your post-war childhood in America?
I grew up as a young boy in a small town in Central California. And then after my father died, we moved to the Southern California, where I could say I grew up from about fourth grade. Okay, well, it was during the Cold War, so I guess we should address that aspect of it, that the Cold War was on, and it certainly had an effect on everybody's life. I guess we could say that the Cold War was a bit like the pandemic. It was an international pandemic also, but it was on everybody's mind. It was constantly in the press and on the media, radio and television. When I was young, radio was still a very important part of everybody's life, and then of course it changed. I can say that life was pretty normal for a young boy growing up through upper elementary school and high school. The Cold War had a major effect because we were always, I guess, being told that there was such a danger of being invaded by the Soviet Union. And of course, the people in the Soviet Union were being told that there was such a danger in their lives of being attacked by Americans. So every Friday, there was a special drill, if you will. The sirens would go off in the cities, and then you were to turn on your radio to listen to a certain station, and that station was the emergency radio network of the government, and it would always say, "This is a Conelrad only practice drill," and blah blah. And of course, if we were in class, which often was the case, we were told to jump under our desks. We were supposed to hide under our desks every Friday during this atomic bomb alert. So things like that were constantly raising our anxiety levels and making us somewhat fearful of the international relations that were between the United States and the Soviet Union. So other than that, I can say I had a quite normal growing up. When a boy in the United States reached the age of 15, what did you want to do? You wanted to get your driver's license. So when you were 15, that was the first thing you did. You went down to the Department of Motor Vehicles and you took the test. And then you got your learner's permit. And I think, I don't know, you had to wait a certain amount of time, maybe a couple of months or something, and do practice driving with a licensed driver. And then you got your driver's license, and then you were a real man. And So that was the introduction to manhood. You had to have your driver's license when I was growing up. I don't know. It may not be quite so today. More, I guess, interesting was that during the war, the kids played war all the time, and we knew who the allies were. I knew that the Soviet Union was our ally, that we were on the same side, and that we were both fighting against the German Nazi fascists, and of course against the Japanese too. So as a young boy growing up, war was a very, very big part of our lives. It, of course, was every time we went to the theater, even the cartoons that Tom and Jerry, you probably know Tom and Jerry as far as American cartoons. Well, Tom and Jerry were always chasing Hitler and Mussolini and Tojo and beating the heck out of them. But as kids growing up, we all had our own war toys. I had my little toy soldiers that I played with on the floor of my room. I would make a rug into mountains and valleys, and I would have my toy soldiers there fighting each other. But of course, only the good guys won my battles. I didn't let the German fascists win any battles when I was a kid. And we had our replica rifles and pistols, little cap guns that went bang bang and things like that. So it was definitely a time that was that affected everybody and certainly kids. And the thing about children, we all thought that we wanted to be soldiers and sailors and airmen, and we really only saw the glory of conquering the enemy. We never understood the terror, the terrible fear that must have run through the soldiers' minds and bodies that were out there on the battlefield. So everybody was glad when the war was over, and I think that also had an effect on when it was hard for me to imagine how, after being such close friends with the Soviet Union, how could all of a sudden the Cold War develop and we became enemies with the world's greatest stockpiles of atomic weapons that could destroy all of us. Well, anyway, that's past. But now I see. I don't understand now, of course, the situation between the United States and Russia. I think it's unfortunately, I have to take to some degree the side of Russia, because I think the United States does not try to understand where Russia comes from. We in the United States in World War II had no cities that were bombed by the enemy. There were no German bombers, Japanese bombers that flew over our cities. We had no cities that were destroyed. We sat here basically in safety, and 25 million Russian Soviets were killed during the Great Patriotic War. And every family in the Soviet Union can relate to that. I've even marched in the in the March of Remembrance every May Day when I was in Russia, of course. And I fully understand how the Russia's concern about being attacked from the West at least Napoleon, and then the First World War, and then the Second World War. I just think that we should be able to solve our problems, our difficulties, our differences by talking it out and trying to understand each other. And that was what Magadane and Alaska was all about. That's why when in the 1980s, when Gorbachev, Mikhail Sergeyevich, came into power in 1985, and then we said, wow, this looks like there's some possibilities of things changing. And so, of course, Alaska and was the closest state to the Soviet Union. And there were many people in Alaska that saw people in Magadan being very close neighbors. And maybe we should look out across the Bering Sea and see if we can't do something to come together. And that was the time that I was fortunate to be a part of, and it changed my whole life. So Magadan has been my life for the past 30 years, I guess.
So who planted or where did your love for the Soviet Union and Russian culture start?
Okay, well, I think that, first of all, during World War II, the Great Patriotic War, I certainly was aware of the Soviet Union and its relationship to the United States. Afterwards, we went into the Cold War period, and it was at that time that I continued, and I sort of wondered what's going on, and why are we going from good friends to Cold War enemies? Well, about the age of 12, my mother bought me a Zenith transoceanic radio, and I was able to listen. I was always interested in foreign countries and this kind of thing. And of course, the Soviet Union was in the media all the time. And so this transoceanic radio, shortwave radio, gave me the opportunity to listen to Radio Moscow. So I used to lay awake late at night, because at night is the time when shortwave seems to work the best. So I would often listen to Radio Moscow, the BBC, Radio Australia, and I was always interested in those kinds of programs. Now, from about the age of 12 or something like that. And I know we had some people on our street where I grew up that had gone to Europe, and I sold papers when I was a kid, and these people, I always took their paper over to their house, and they were going to Europe, and I thought, oh my gosh, going to Europe. Well, I thought that I had about as much chance of going to Europe as I did to go to the moon. So I just thought, well, I'll never be able to go to Europe. That's just way beyond my my ability. Okay, so then just time went on, and of course, I guess, being influenced by President Roosevelt during World War II. He was a champion of the poor, of people who didn't, of the ordinary man, and I sort of grew up with his influence and read several of his biographies and things of this nature. And so Franklin Roosevelt was my hero. And then, of course, learning more about what the Soviet Union was all about. And in those days, I had a limited knowledge. I, of course, was very open to propaganda. And when you talked about communism, you talked about everybody being equal. Well, of course, it wasn't too difficult to see in the United States that under capitalism, everybody wasn't equal. And you can certainly see that today. And so as a young person growing up, I thought, gee, well, that sounds pretty good. I should look more into that. And so I did. Well, that was part of the Soviet propaganda, and we know that. And then also, I grew up as I mentioned in the Catholic Church, which isn't so far removed from the Russian Orthodox Church, and there's things called monasteries. I mean, one of my very favorite places is the Troitya Sergeyeva Lavra in Sergeyev Posad. Well, that's communism. That's everybody is equal there, and everybody's supposedly looking out for everybody else. Well, of course, that's an unrealistic situation for society. It's not. That's not the way where people are. But growing up, I thought that sounded pretty good, and so I did some reading there, and then of course thought that as I got to be older, and well, I guess we could jump from there until I moved to Alaska. Well, when I moved to Alaska in 1970, after I finished my university work, Alaska was Staraya Russia. And so the history of Alaska is the history of Russia. And I became very interested in Alaskan history and was a member of the Historical Society. And we had some, we had a group of people that were interested in particularly the transfer ceremony in 1867. October 18th, 1867 was the date of the transfer of Alaska to the United States from Imperial Russia. So then, well, that was a little bit before Gorbachev, for sure. So as time went on, I taught Alaska history and was very involved because I lived in Sitka. Well, Sitka is Novoarkhanghelsk. Well, that was the capital of Russian America from 1804. Well, so there was St. Michael's Cathedral, Sobor was there still, and the Russian bishop's house, and of course I was very interested in native because I was working with Alaska Native kids and in their cultures and anthropology. So Sitka was absolutely a great place for me at that time, and so I learned a lot about Russia because Sitka would be the place that it was all about. And then as years went on, I had other teaching jobs in other places in Alaska, and I ended up on the Kenai Peninsula. And this was also a very historical, in the 1740s, the first Russian settlements were on the Kenai Peninsula were right there on the bluff in Kenai. And then as things changed with Reagan and Gorbachev, I was in Soldotna. And at some point, of course, we were always aware during the Cold War that there were some people that were getting together. There were the Bolshoi, Kirov, Moiseyev, Russian Soviet dancers would tour different major cities in the United States, and they would be appreciated by thousands. I mean, there was a very strong interest in the United States by people on the part of trying to learn more about Russia, about the Soviet Union, and of course to bring peace. And there were, I was aware that there were people that had pen pals in the Soviet Union, not just Russian pen pals, but there were 15 different republics, so they could have had pen pals throughout the Soviet Union. And so I thought, well, you know, if other people are doing it, why can't we? So I found, I thought, well, we've got to find out how to be able to connect with kids in the Soviet Union. I have to find out how I can get some schools in the Soviet Union that want to participate in some sort of a pen pal program. So there was an organization called pairing project in California. I found out about, and they were instrumental in connecting schools in the United States with schools in the Soviet Union. Well, this was just wonderful. And so I naturally contacted them, and we found out that it was possible. So then I got, from them, I was able to get some addresses. Actually, I don't remember how many, but anyway, I selected Magadan. Where in the world is Magadan? Nobody's ever heard of Magadan. That must be in another planet. Well, no, it's not another planet. It's our neighbor. It's right across the Bering Straits. But of course, there's an ice curtain that is blocking us from having any sort of contact. Well, so the pairing project gave me 3 addresses. Well, I don't know about 3, how many, but anyway, one was Magadan, another was in Ulyanovsk, Lenin's hometown, and then another, I don't know whether they suggested it or I just decided, but was Radio Moscow. Vladimir Posner, you may have heard of. He was the major person during the late Cold War era on Radio Moscow, and he had even what they called, I forgot what they're called, television bridges. So he would connect with Phil Donahue in New York, and Phil Donahue would have people in the studio, and Vladimir Posner would have people in the studio, and they had a space bridge, so they were able to connect. And just like we're doing here, we have people in 3 different places, and they had this connection between New York and Moscow, I guess. And so they had people communicating with each other. Well, that was wonderful. So and then I listened to Vladimir Posner on Radio Moscow quite extensively. So I thought, well, what to do? So I decided, first of all, I needed to, my students, of course, they were familiar with the concept, the Soviet Union, but they didn't know much about it. They certainly didn't know to any degree what life was like there for the people, or for what students' lives were like. And so I said, well, we got to change this, because there's a lot of Time Magazine, Newsweek, the press, the television were always having stories about something about either Reagan or Gorbachev, or life for people in the Soviet Union. So I said, we talked, well, first of all, I was able to find a good textbook that was quite comprehensive. It was designed at the high school level. Well, I was teaching upper elementary, not so far from high school. Kids are always can do more than most teachers expect of them. So I got several copies, enough for everybody, and I developed a Soviet studies program. And this meant that we were using the textbook as part of our social studies program. It fit right in with the history of Alaska, and I was teaching that at the same time. And then we decided, this is in '86. We put together a package. We had been doing this Soviet studies program for the better part of a year, and said, what can we do? Well, let's take pictures of ourselves, of our families, of our school, and then we'll write letters. Every one of my students, the 30 students in my class, wrote a hand letter. Needless to say, for some, I think it was the first letter that they'd ever written in their life, because, kids don't write letters. And but we didn't have the internet in those days, and we didn't even have, well, I guess maybe we were just getting computers. So everybody wrote a hand, dear pen pal. Don't know who, but they had to write 3, because we were going to send 3 packages of over to the three places that I just mentioned. So we had all kinds of photographs. Kids brought in photographs of their family that they could include, of the school activities. Then we had each student wrote 3 pen pal letters, dear pen pal, and then we put together a song, a recording like Putsegda Budyat Sonsa, and we had my kids singing a few little Russian peace songs and some American. We put those audio cassettes in the boxes, and then we ended up sending these off. Well, okay, we didn't know what was going to happen, and so it was in the spring. So we all left for summer vacation. We hadn't heard back from anybody, and so the when we came back in the fall, we said, well, we hope that maybe somebody got these and that we'll have a reply. Well, it must have been not too long after school started that one day the secretary of the school, so I continued my Soviet studies classes. And then I decided, because we had one person in the district that was pretty fluent in Russian. And he was the bilingual teacher, bilingual director, and he worked with the Stadivera. We have still today a rather large contingent in a village called Nikolaevsk on the Kenai Peninsula of Stadivera people. Well, there's more than one now because they split off. So there are about 3 villages inhabited primarily with Stadivera people. So Rick was actually teaching Russian language at the community college, and then I took his class one year. So I had very, very beginning Russian language, but enough that we could start teaching Russian language to our elementary school kids, to my class, only my class. Nobody else was crazy enough to do something like this. So we, and then I had been in 1988, my then wife, and I had gone on an Interist tour to 5 hero cities: Moscow, Leningrad, Kyiv, Minsk, Odessa, and where? Oh, Stalin and Volgograd. And it was wonderful. Absolutely learned a great deal at that time. So, and then I bought a bunch of stuff in Dom Knigy and maps and books and all kinds of toys and stuff. So I decorated my room. It looked like a Soviet museum. So when we'd have Soviet studies, we had Russian hats, we had Navy hats, we had Navy belt buckles and toys, wind-up toys, and a big Soviet flag hanging in the middle, and then pictures of the Politburo and Gorbachev, and peace posters plastered around the walls. So I thought we used to kid, but we said, well, all this Soviet stuff hanging around makes for our classes got the real collective spirit. We're all learning together. Okay, so and the kids were very, very interested. They really they got to do something that nobody else got to do. And then, as I said, we sent these 3 boxes off to these 3 different locations. So one, in the fall of 1987, the secretary came and knocked on our door. And I opened the door, and he says, oh, Larry, the postman just delivered 3 letters from Magadan. Well, I mean, this was like, Christmas could never have been any better than that. Well, needless to say, that more than made our day. And everybody, of course, the 3 kids that got the letters were the real lucky ones. And then the local newspaper came and took pictures of the kids that got the letters, and then Russian kids' letters were quoted in the local newspaper, and it was that's what really started a big community-wide awareness, and then of course it just grew from there, and we continued to write pen pals. The sad thing was, the difficult thing was that to send a letter from Soldotna, Alaska to Magadan, Russia took about 3 weeks one way. It meant it went from Soldotna to Anchorage, Anchorage to Seattle, probably Seattle to New York, then New York to Magadan, New York to Moscow, Moscow across the Soviet Union to Magadan. Well, and of course they came back the same way. We're 4 hours by air. Anchorage to Magadan is 4 hours, and instead of 3 or more weeks for the mail. So that made it a little bit of a challenge, but we kept going, and we had heard that it was a big deal, that they were very pleased at school number 1 to receive this from Alaska. Then we heard that Gennady Gerasimov, who was Gorbachev's chief spokesman, in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, was coming to Anchorage. Well, we were really interested in having a real exchange with people to people. That we wanted to invite people from Magadan, students and teachers, to come to Alaska. And the thing that in those days, and probably is still today true, is that everything is reciprocal. In other words, if I invite you to come and to visit my class, then you're obligated to invite me to come to your class. Well, that was a very nice thing in those days, and it certainly worked out well. What most people wanted in Magadan and in Alaska was the opportunity to do business. Obviously, in the Soviet era of those days, consumer goods were not quite, which might be a rather gross understatement, available to the extent that they were in the United States. And Governor Cooper met with Vyacheslav Kovets, who was the governor of Magadan at that time, and in Providencia, and lots of other people. That was a big deal. And it was only for the day. They flew over on Alaska Airlines and they flew back. All right, so then it was in, I think in September, or I think October now of 1988, when Governor Kovets was going to bring a delegation of Soviet people to Alaska, and he was going to come via Providencia on the research vessel, the Dmitry Laptiev. Okay, so he brought, I don't know how many, not so many, less than 100, maybe 30 or 30 some people, journalists, some Alaska natives, and other people. He came to Nome. So the Dmitry Laptiev sailed from Providencia to Nome. And so when I heard that, I said, wow, they already know us as far as teachers and students, because Magadan School number 1 received our box with all of our little goodies in it, letters and etc. Okay, so I said, well, this is our chance to have some contact with real Magadan people. And so I said, what can we do? So once again, went back to my class, and then we discussed this with, of course, some of the other people. And we decided that we could buy a TV, a VCR, some good American videos, video cassettes, books, solar-powered calculators and things of that nature, and we can take them to Governor Kobyets when he comes over on the Dmitry Laptiev. So this is basically what we did. We knew when they were coming. They were going to come to Anchorage the day after they arrived in Nome, and then I said, well, I talked to some people in Anchorage that told me no, all their time was tied up in Anchorage, and it wouldn't be possible for us to meet with them. Well, that was not the news I wanted to hear. So I called another friend in Nome, and Jim Stimfel, and he said, sure, Larry, come up. And when we do a tour of the Nome Elementary School, you can do the presentation. You and your students and Rick can do the presentation at the Nome School when Governor Kobyets and the delegation arrived there. Wow, this was great. So I called the president of Alaska Airlines, and I said, well, Rick and I will be glad to pay our own fare, but I would like to bring 2 students. Would you help out? Well, of course, they said sure, and they paid the way of 2 of my students to come to do the presentation too. So we were able to buy, with the help of people in the Soldotnej community, all this stuff and donations, of course, of books and other things, and we put this all together, and then Rick and I and my 2 students, and we had taught them to do their presentation in Russian. And Governor Hickel, the previous governor of Alaska, had a big reception that we went to before going to Nome, and that was when I first got to meet with Governor Kobyets, who has been a lifelong friend, and then a man from school number 1, who I don't know if you know or not. I think he was gone before you would have had a chance to meet him. But Dima Poletayev was a fellow professor later at Magadan Pet Institute with me, and he did the translation for me during the meetings with Governor Kobyets, and we developed a really strong bond over the 3 days that we were able to be together, and we had a wonderful tour and of the ship of the Dmitry Laptiev on one of those days, and the captain invited us to have lunch there with him on board the ship, and gave us a grand tour, and that was the first time my students had ever tasted wonderful Russian cuisine. So we had quite an experience there, and so then Governor Kobyets took the VCR, the TV, and all the books and calculators and this kind of stuff back to school number 1. And needless to say, they were pretty happy about that too. Well, so we're talking about, again, late 1988. And so they went back and then we said what to do. Now there's we're totally dependent upon some sort of a charter flight. And then I think it was in maybe late November or early December, maybe late November. It was very late, emphasis on the word late, to put this all together. But I read in the Anchorage Daily News that Vyacheslav Kobyets, the governor, was planning to bring 90 people over on a delegation to Anchorage in February of the next year. Well, here we are in December, and February is not very far off. So I fired off a both long and long distance international telegram to Lyubov Shaitanova, who was the director of school number 1 in Magadan, and inviting Lyubov and 2 teachers. Well, I was inviting 3 teachers and 3 students to come to spend the 8 days with my school in Soldatna, Alaska. Okay, well, and as I said earlier, I knew that if it was accepted, then we would have an invitation to go to Magadan. Well, that was our goal, of course, was to and so long story, and eventually they agreed. I said, I'm sure to Lubov that if you can, that Vyacheslav Kobyets will find a place on his airplane for you. Well, he did. And so they came over on February 20th of 1989, and we went back on the Aeroflot Tupolev 154 to Magadan. And so that was the first visit between students there. So we were in Magadan for 8 days, and their Magadan teachers were hosted by my colleagues and families and people in Soldatna. And so of course that was an unforgettable experience. I mean, Magadan was a pure Soviet city, and it was quite different from what we were experiencing in Alaska. Now, it wasn't totally unknown because, of course, there had been so much in the media, in the press, about life in the Soviet Union. Well, not so much about Magadan, I don't think, if anything, but certainly about daily life. And I know for my Russian and Soviet studies classes, I used a couple of BBC documentaries, which were much less propagandistic, if you will, and not trying to show how bad things were, but just trying to show how things were in the Soviet Union. And of course, it was similar to Alaska in terms of, I think, the two things that were most similar were the cold and the snow, because it was February in 1989, and that was a cold day. And but it was, I mean, I still have contact. Well, as you know, I have lots of contact with Magadan. I mean, I consider it my Russian hometown, Rudnoy Gorod. And when I was there, we had lots of meetings because this was the idea was now to start an exchange program, to start something whereby students could be coming back and forth each year to study for short intervals in each other's schools. So that was the main focus that we had lots of meetings. Well, of course, in those days, everybody wondered what life was like for each of us on the other side of the ice curtain. And so the focus in our meetings in Magadan was, what's life like for you as a teacher, for you kids as students, for you people who live in Soldatna, Alaska? Okay, well, of course, we could answer most of those questions. And I think we tried to be as honest as possible. One thing I never tried to say was that, well, the United States is a lot better than the Soviet Union. I never, first of all, I never thought that anyway. Everybody's different. We all do things differently, and that's what makes the world interesting. But I was a student just as much as they were. And every place I went, I felt that I was a student. If I was visiting with somebody in their home, then their home was my classroom and they were my teachers. If I was shopping at Targovy Center, then Targovy Center was my classroom, and the cashiers and the shop assistants were my teachers. If I was in Vashod, the same thing. Vashod was my classroom, or Chaika, Domadezhda, wherever it was. Those were my classrooms, and the people there were my teachers. And so obviously, it's one thing to visit someplace, and it's totally another thing to live there. And I loved it. But people were warm and friendly and made me feel like a part of their family. So then one thing, then we went back and with signed protocols after the first meeting with the Galina Maximova, who was the superintendent of schools of the Oblast, and Lyubov Shaitanova, the director of school number 1. And we signed protocols of agreement that we wanted to come together and to have further exchanges. So we did. And if anything, we were so sad to leave. We felt so welcome, so at home with the people, with our new Soviet friends in Magadan, that it literally, of course, it changed our lives forever. And so we went back, Rick and I, and the three of us, actually, there were 3 teachers and 3 students. And then we had meetings in Soldotna with the superintendent, and we said, well, you know, this looks really like an opportunity of a lifetime. And so he said, yes, go for it. Well, so then Rick and I and another teacher went back a month later to Magadan, and we had further meetings and developed further protocols that said, yes, we're going to have this next meeting whenever it was. I don't know, in the next school year, of which we did. But that was the time when I was speaking with some of the teachers, my friends at school number 1 in Magadan, and I said, gee, I really would like to come here and teach for a year, and come here and live and really be a student and see what life is really like for Soviet people. And so I'm wondering, you know, if there'd be any opportunities in the schools for me to come and teach. And they said, Larry, that's not where you need to be. Said, you need to be at Magadan Pet Institute, because the weakness of so many Soviet foreign language programs is that they do not have native language speakers. So I said, okay, well, show me the way. And so they pointed that way and said, that's MPI, go for it. Well, that's a joke, but they set up a meeting with Dr. Rector Yevgeny Kokarov, who was the rector at that time. Unfortunately, he's passed away. And then Roman Tchaikovsky, who was the dean of the foreign language department. Well, so I went there. I met with Roman up in the cathedra, and he took me over to Yevgeny's office. We went and had a couple-hour meeting, and I suggested that maybe we could have an exchange program between the University of Alaska and Magadan Pedagogical Institute. They said, yes, we're very interested. And Dr. Kokarov said, well, if you can get the University of Alaska to do this, to go with this, then we'd like to invite you to come and be a professor in the English language cathedra of Magadan Pet Institute. I said, wow. I said, that's my dream of a lifetime. So I did. I went back and with another friend who was a president of the Board of Regents, which is sort of the governing body of the university. And we submitted a letter to the president of the University of Alaska suggesting that I come and we discuss this. I did. And the president of the University of Alaska said, yes, let's go for it. And so then I had to get permission to take a sabbatical from my school district, of which I was able to do. And then I left in that September to come and teach for a year at Magadan Pet Institute, which was absolutely the most wonderful year of education experience of teaching in my 30 years. The students were absolutely the best students I had ever taught. and the whole experience was a highlight of my career in education. And of course, then after the first year, they wanted me to stay again. Well, it was a little bit of a challenge. I went from because I had a house in Soldotной. Well, to make rubles in Magadan, they didn't do much for me as far as my expenses that I had in Alaska. Rubles just didn't work over in Alaska. So I had to, of course, pay my mortgage, my monthly house payment from my savings. Okay, because I wasn't getting any salary from the Kenai school district. But then anyway, I mean, I always felt that the experience was way more valuable than the difference in the exchange rate between rubles and dollars in those days. And so then after the first year, they said, Larry, you got to come back, and because I had a 1-year visa, so I had to go back to Alaska, which I did, and then Dr. Kokarev and the teachers, Governor Kobiets, all wrote letters saying, please let Larry come back for another year. So I negotiated a second year of sabbatical and came back for the second year. Well, the second year was, in a way, it was very similar to the first year because, of course, I had a new class, which were also wonderful kids. I mean, I just enjoyed, and I still have contact with at least three of my old students that live in Moscow right now. I mean, we're on WhatsApp all the time. So, and probably could find a few more. But, and then, of course, with some of the ladies in the cathedra who were my students back in those days. So I came back, and I had my flat. I loved my I felt a little bit embarrassed because when I came there, I knew the situation to some degree, the situation of housing in the Soviet Union. And I knew what a communal flat meant. And I had friends that were living in the общежития in the university. Well, it wasn't exactly luxurious living conditions. And so when I came back, they had an agreement between Gennady Dorofeyev, the Magadan mayor, and Dr. Kokarev, the rector. I had a 1-room flat. Well, it was way more than I really needed. It was very nicely fitted out. I mean, a refrigerator. Not everybody in the Soviet Union had a refrigerator back in those days. Those were somewhat rare items. I had a telephone in my flat, and it was very comfortable. So on Boldarevo, near Targovy Center, and so I felt that to some degree I would have been better off, and my Russian language would have progressed far better if I had been in a communal flat. And of course, it would have been a very different and less comfortable experience because we were able to have lots of meetings and things like that in my flat informally, and it was very nice. I had the good opportunity, the unbelievable opportunity, one day to have some lady come to the university where I am, Magadan Pet Institute, and ask me about a brochure that she had received from a fellow friend of ours, a mutual friend from the University of Alaska. Well, one thing led to another. I was able to answer some of her questions, and then she was doing genetics research at the Institute of Biological Problems, and so to make a long story short, I found this lady to be very interesting, a wonderful person, and ended up saying, I'd like to spend the rest of my life with you. And so she fortunately agreed. And for the past 30 years, we've been trekking around every place. She did her doctorate at Cambridge University in England. And so we have been from Magadan to Cambridge to Soldotna to trekking up and down Susiman and Kadexchan and the Kolimatrasa.
So what other like extraordinary people have you met back then in Magadan, like during your stay for like 2 years? So you mentioned Ramanovich and
Well, yes, of course. Raman would be maybe the most exceptional in terms of his interest and his his academic stature. I mean, he was a great scholar. He was fluent in Ukrainian, in German, in English, Russian. He had written extensively in those languages. He was a pioneer along with Yevgeny Kokorev in terms of leading the way to develop exchange programs and bring people from Alaska to Magadan and to send our students to Alaska. And here's we just hit it off very well from the very beginning, and I learned a lot from him. I suppose that maybe he learned a little bit from me, being an American, and but yeah, I'd say he was certainly one of the most interesting and influential. He had done so much for so many of the faculty there, and encouraged people to go on and pursue their kandidatskaya and to their doctorates. So he was you can almost say he was a legend there, a great professor, a great friend. I mean, to some degree, everybody was interesting because everybody had grown up in a different way than I had grown up. So when I was meeting with people, I was, as I said, learning from them. And so some of the most interesting people I met were of course, on the faculty at Magadan Pedagogical Institute, but some of them weren't. I'm thinking of a man named Igor Morozov, who was an An-Dava pilot, an AN-2 biplane pilot. He was one of the most interesting people, because his profession took him not only out into the smaller communities, the mining communities up and down the Kolima Trasa, but just being a pilot of a biplane made him very interesting to me. Being able to experience Hebgenic and some of the native cultures was, of course, very interesting to me because I had quite an extensive background in Alaska Native anthropology and in working with Alaska Native people.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask you, like, what do you think? Russians and Americans. Yeah, we several times we heard this opinion from different people that we are two sides of one coin. Like we were like separated brothers at some point. So because there are lots of similarities between us, but just on the on the different extent. So what's your point on this?
I think that's one way of looking at it. I think that over the past, in my lifetime, I've seen, even though Russia, as far as experientially, only came into my life in the late 80s under Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, and so I've seen tremendous change in terms of Russia. I've seen the people in Russia go from quite a decent life under the Soviet system to basically a crash, to see under Yeltsin a very severe depression when people were literally thrown out of work, lost their jobs, were starving, had to sell personal possessions like books and kitchenware and whatever they could just to pay the rent or buy food, to a standard of living today that's not so far removed from what we have here. Now, of course, Russia is a big country, and you can go and see the difference between Magadan and Moscow is great. And if you go even further into the rural areas of Russia, you see that to some degree, maybe things haven't changed that much, that there's still a lack of many of the amenities that people enjoy in the larger cities. So Russia has experienced great change. Its people are enjoying a much higher standard of living than when I first moved to the Soviet Union, and I think that's great. Not that there aren't problems. There are problems in Russia, just like there are problems in America that we haven't solved. But the overall conditions in the past 30 years, from the Soviet era to the end of the Soviet era to today, in Russia are mind-boggling. You have almost everything. In fact, sometimes when I come back from being in Moscow, Sergei Posad region, and I just think, wow, there's more there than there is in some places in the United States available. And some of the I told several people here, I said, I've been in supermarkets in Moscow that make some of our fancy supermarkets here look like a country store. They just have everything and quite a few things that we don't have here. So I mean, it's hard to buy good kefir here, and tvorog, and of course I love pelmeni and bubliki and pirishki, and fortunately I found recently a store, a Ukrainian lady in her 50s or 60s that has a little store here that's not so different from a little store in Sergei Posad, where you can buy Borodinsky and Chorny Chleb and Slyodka and kefir and things, and they're imported. I like baklajania ikra, and it's in fact I had it today with some Borodinsky that I bought there. So and I just found that out. I mean, I've been living, except when Lena would come over, she would bring, or I would bring, when I would come over from 6 months in Russia, my suitcase would be filled with Borodinsky and Maisky chai and Russian products like that. So, but no, the life in Russia, I think, has changed greatly, and I saw that when I was living in Moscow. So I sort of miss. I mean, I'm glad. I consider it's such a privilege to have been able to live in Magadan during the last 2 years of the Soviet Union, because I remember what the state food shops were like. I remember when if you wanted to buy a piece of meat and you saw a little piece of red on the bone, oh, that was pretty good, because that meant red meant meat. And if you only saw fat on it, it was pretty much white. So now you buy the same, you can buy good quality almost of everything. And so So life has changed, and it's gotten a lot better for people. So, молодец, good for them. So the way it is not going to make a whole lot of people happy. There are a whole lot of people that are not so thrilled with the way the situation is there. Well, and I can say, you know, it's quite different here, but I'm also not totally thrilled with the way the situation is here in terms of the number of guns, the number of murders, the number of mass shootings in schools and things of that nature. It's awful. I mean, it's absolutely deplorable. So, of course, I feel quite safe here in our nice, comfortable house. I'm able to have enough food. Food is not hard for me to get, but there's no paradise no matter where you're at. And there are lots of, as you well know, people that are suffering in the United States without employment, people that are suffering from COVID because they are living in situations where they can't escape from the virus. I'm very lucky, and so many people are. I mean, it's sort of crazy when I think we have this 3-bedroom house here. One person is living in it, and that's not uncommon. I mean, I look around the neighborhood, and everybody here that I know has way more space and comfort than they really need.
Why did this program, this exchange program, why did it come to the end?
Well, first of all, let's say, why did it come, period. In those days of Gorbachev, the feeling, the excitement was so strong that people in Magadan wanted so badly to learn more about what life was like in the West. And so when I went to Magadan, it was as if everything in the United States was wonderful and everything in the Soviet Union was bad. And of course, I never agreed with that. I said, the United States has many, many faults, and it's etanilai. It's not a paradise. And when you look at the racial prejudice against Black people, American Indians, Mexican people, and that, it's terrible. It's shameful. And but the enthusiasm was just unbelievable. Everybody couldn't think practically of anything but Alaska in those days. And every student, every teacher in Magadan, not every teacher, but teachers in Magadan, always wanted me to come and speak to their classes. Okay, well, that of course lasted for quite a while. Now, we were dependent upon Aeroflot charter flights for a long time to be able to get students in one direction or in either direction. So to get students to Alaska from Magadan Pedagogical Institute, we had to wait until there was going to be a charter flight. And then that, of course, would bring back students from the University of Alaska to Magadan. So the price was right. In the beginning, the government paid for Magadan students to come. And then later on, of course, there were fees. So when the schools were doing it, the school pretty much paid. And then it got to the point where the parents that could afford it would have to pay. So it was only students from the schools whose parents could afford. And then as far as the university was concerned, it went from being able to come across on a charter without having to pay to having to pay. Now, Magadan students had this kind of a situation. They could take classes at the University of Alaska free of charge, без платно. They didn't have to pay any tuition. And so they were fluent in English. So they had a much broader choice in terms of what classes to take at the University of Alaska that would be interesting to them than the University of Alaska classes. Because what we could offer at Magadan Pedagogical Institute for the University of Alaska students was basically Russian language. And of course, the opportunity to live in a Soviet family, with a Soviet family, and experience life in Magadan. Well, certainly there's a whole lot that one can learn that's not going to be learned in a classroom. So they had the American students, the Alaskan kids, had an opportunity to see something that they never would have had the opportunity to see if it hadn't been for this exchange program. And then, so that lasted really for about 10 years, I'd say. And then after that, there were, at one time, there were flights that Aeroflot had scheduled flights going from Magadan to Anchorage. And Magadan, Anchorage, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and back around. And then it also went Magadan, Habarovsk, Anchorage too. So, but then the traffic dried up. In other words, the interest waned greatly after about 10 years. There wasn't that much interest, and it seemed that there were a lot of other possibilities of commerce taking place. Business people were able to get goods that they wanted to sell in Magadan from other places and via other cities other than Anchorage and Alaska. So basically it stopped because there was no interest and there was no money. So there's still, I mean, you can still, obviously you can go from Magadan to Alaska, but it's around the world. You know, to go from Magadan to Moscow, Moscow to New York, New York to Seattle, Seattle to Alaska. That's a long flight.
Yeah, it's like 20 hours, I guess, right?
Yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I'm sure at least.
So do you think something like this exchange or this level of interest between like our nations is like possible to like recreate and to have again these programs, maybe some more of pen pals stuff and exchange? Like what could we do for this in Magadan?
Well, that's a big question. And of course, the times back in 1980s were so different from the times now. I mean, there's no comparison. In fact, I'd say, right now, it'd be impossible because, well, first of all, in 1989, Soviet people were basically prisoners within their own country. You didn't have the opportunity to get an external passport. That was really unusual. Well, before Gorbachev, I should say. It was very unusual for an average Soviet person to be able to travel to a foreign country. I mean, there were times in 1988 when we were traveling in the Hero Cities Interest program that, you weren't supposed to talk to an American. You weren't supposed to talk to a foreigner, let alone an American, and let alone stay in a Soviet person's flat. That was really taboo. And that's one thing that we stressed with the exchange. I said, hey, this has to be, we cannot be over there staying in a hotel. This has to be people to people. This has to be family to family. I want my students to be able to see what a real Soviet family is like. And I want the kids from Magadan to be able to see what living in a Alaskan family is like. Now, that was the window to the West had been, closed for a long time. And now under Gorbachev, it was just being opened again. So everybody was looking out the window across the Bering Sea to see what they could find, what was there. And that's not the case anymore. The world is very, very open. With the internet, everybody knows about everybody else. There's no, it's not the same situation at all.
We have a common question we ask every our guest. It's basically one word, trasa.
Oh, trasa, Kolyma trasa?
Yes.
Oh, wow. First of all, it's just beautiful country. It's absolutely beautiful wilderness. And I think it, because we've been able to, my wife did a study of state-induced migration there. And so we've had the opportunity to visit Susiman, Shemchan, Holodny, Bolshevik, Yavensk, and so many other of those communities, Atka, with Pasha and Andrei and Anatoly Shirokov. So I would say, it's been a very interesting place for us to experience. For me personally, to be able to have had the opportunity to go up the Kolyma Trasa to see the beauty of nature, to learn about the history, much of it not so pleasant for so many people, and but I wouldn't trade the Kolyma Trasa experiences for anything. Talia, I had the opportunity to spend a day, 2 days in Talia back in the 1980s with Vyacheslav Kobyets and Stanislav Alifer, the great naturalist writer from that region. And those were unforgettable memories too.
Okay, so last time we spoke to Valery Tsirtsins. So, and his question is, compare your hometown's past and present.
Okay, first of all, hometowns with an S, plural, because I lived in quite a few.
Yeah.
And of course they were the usual American hometown. Nothing very interesting or exciting in particular. And so it wasn't until my Rudnoy Gorod of Magadan that I can say a hometown became something very interesting. And I don't have any real identity with the towns that I lived in growing up. They were all just very ordinary American cities. And now, but then when, of course, I moved to Magadan in 1989 for 2 years, that was a totally different experience. So my memories since 1980s are almost filled with, as far as a hometown, with Magadan.
And now your question to our next guest.
What differences at this point in history does he see between Russia and the West?
All right. What would be your wishes to our listeners?
Well, I don't know who your listeners are, but I would say that being able to visit and experience other people, other cultures, other countries, and to try to understand other people's beliefs and desires and you know, and what's important to them is important for everybody. We need to understand each other and where we're coming from, and try to look into each other's backgrounds, because that's what makes us different. And we can't be ethnocentric. That just doesn't work today.
Thank you very much for joining us and like taking us on this journey. It was really interesting. So I hope to see you and your book soon, like in Magadan or
Well, thanks.
somewhere else.